Garrett James didn't expect to be learning a waltz in a dusty community center on a Thursday night, especially not with his 6-year-old daughter asleep on the folding chair beside the stereo. But he needed this. Step, step. Glide, the instructor called out, her voice echoing off the scuffed wooden floor. Garrett tried to keep up, his steel-toe boots awkward against the rhythm of the music. Sweat clung to his neck, and his flannel stuck to his back from the heat of the room. His partner was late again. That meant another round of dancing solo while older couples glided by like they had been born in tuxedos and heels. He glanced at the clock. Almost 7. He had to be home by 8:30 to help Maddie with her reading. He sighed, ready to call it when the door opened. And in walked the most beautiful woman he'd ever seen. She had long dark hair pulled into a soft twist, a navy blue sweater tucked into high-waisted jeans that somehow looked expensive even though they were plain. Her eyes scanned the room before landing on him. She smiled. "Sorry I'm late," she said, approaching him with her hand extended. "I'm Juliet Emerson. The instructor said you needed a partner." Garrett blinked, surprised. Yeah, I'm Garrett. Thanks for showing up." They shook hands and her grip was firm, confident. She stepped into place beside him like she'd done it 100 times, but there was something about her that didn't match the small-town dance class vibe. Her posture was too straight, her voice too polished. "All right," she said, looking up at him. "Let's try it." "Step, step, glide," he nodded, trying not to notice how good she smelled, like vanilla and something warm and expensive. They moved awkward at first, then slowly more in sync. She laughed when he stepped on her toe. "Sorry," he murmured. "You're doing fine," she said, her smile easy. "I've had worse. One guy spun me into a trash can." He chuckled, relaxing a little. "Well, that's a high bar to beat." They danced for a while, and Juliet didn't complain once about his boots or the fact that he counted out loud. She moved with grace, guiding him without making it obvious. When the music paused, he reached for a towel and glanced over at Maddie, who was still curled up beneath her pink blanket, thumb tucked under her cheek. "Your daughter?" Juliet asked gently. "Yeah," he said. "That's Maddie. I'm a single dad. Her mom left when she was 4. "Just us now." Juliet's eyes softened. "She's beautiful." Garrett gave a small smile. "She's the reason I'm doing this. Her school's having a daddy-daughter dance. I don't want to step on her feet all night." Juliet blinked, clearly touched. "That's honestly wonderful." He shrugged, suddenly self-conscious. "I'm not great at this stuff. I work construction, long hours. There's not a lot of time for waltzing." "Well," Juliet said, taking his hand again, "you're doing better than you think." They continued dancing, and as the night went on, Garrett almost forgot how tired he was. Juliet laughed easily, asked about his work, even helped pick up Maddie's blanket when it slipped off her chair. When the class ended, Garrett walked her to her car, an unassuming black sedan, and thanked her. "Same time next week?" she asked. He hesitated. "You sure? I'm not exactly graceful." "I'm sure," she said with a smile that made his chest feel tight. "I'll see you next Thursday, Garrett." She drove off into the night, and he stood there for a second, wondering who exactly Juliet Emerson really was. She didn't act like she was from around here. But he didn't think too much about it. He had a lunch to pack and a bedtime story to read. The following Thursday, Juliet returned. And the Thursday after that. Each week, Garrett got a little better. Their movements smoother, the tension between them tighter. "Okay," Juliet said one evening, laughing as Garrett dipped her a little too far. "You're either trying to impress me or break my back." He grinned. "Can't it be both?" She rolled her eyes, but her cheeks flushed. Later, while Maddie colored with crayons at the side of the room, Juliet leaned in closer than before. "You ever do something just because it feels right, even if it doesn't make sense?" Garrett tilted his head. "Like showing up to dance class when you clearly belong somewhere fancier." Juliet's smile faded a little, but there was something in her eyes. "Maybe I just wanted something real." He didn't know what to say to that, but he knew what he felt. He looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time in years, Garrett felt something stir in his chest that wasn't exhaustion or stress. It was hope. 2 weeks before the dance, Juliet showed up with something wrapped in brown paper. "What's that?" Garrett asked, wiping sawdust from his jeans. He'd come straight from work again. "Just something for Maddie," she said, handing it to him. "It's a dress. I saw it and thought of her." He opened it, revealing a pale pink tulle dress with tiny embroidered flowers. It was beautiful. Too beautiful, Garrett's throat tightened. Juliet, this must have cost, don't worry about it, she said softly. Please. He didn't know what to say. I can't pay you back. I didn't ask you to. He looked at her, really looked. Something about her didn't add up. She drove a plain car, wore simple clothes, but everything about her screamed elegance. Money. Class. Still, she showed up every week. She danced with him. She made Maddie laugh, and he was falling for her fast. He just didn't know how far out of his league she really was. Garrett didn't see Juliet again until the night of the dance. Not at the Thursday class. Not around town, not even a quick text canceling, just nothing. He tried not to let it bother him. Maybe she had a family emergency, or maybe she'd only ever intended to help him with the dancing and had simply moved on. But it did bother him, more than he expected, and Maddie noticed. Is Miss Juliet coming tonight? She asked as he tied the sash on the back of her dress. I'm not sure, kiddo, he said, brushing a curl off her forehead. But we're gonna have fun anyway, all right, she nodded, but her excitement dimmed just a little. Garrett had to admit, he was looking for her the moment they walked into the school gym. Paper lanterns hung from the ceiling, casting soft golden light over the polished floor. Fathers and daughters in their best outfits moved around awkwardly, some dancing, some taking photos in front of a sparkly backdrop. He swallowed the knot in his throat and led Maddie to the edge of the floor. Ready? Maddie nodded and took his hands, tiny fingers wrapped around his calloused ones. They started slow. He remembered the steps. Step, step, glide. She giggled when he forgot to turn. He spun her carefully and she beamed. Other dads watched with a mixture of surprise and admiration. Garrett even heard one of them mutter, "Didn't know Miller could dance like that." He didn't care. All that mattered was the look on Maddie's face, that she felt special, and then the music changed. A softer, slower song started, something old-fashioned and sweeping, and Garrett looked up instinctively. Juliet stood just inside the gym doors. She wore a floor-length navy blue gown with a low back and delicate beading that shimmered under the lights. Her hair was down in soft waves, her eyes scanning the crowd until they landed on him. She held a small white box in her hands. Garrett's heart kicked in his chest. Maddie tugged his sleeve. "Is that Miss Juliet?" "Yeah," he said quietly. Juliet approached, her heels silent on the gym floor. The other dads stopped to stare. A few mothers, too. She didn't seem to notice or care. "I'm sorry I disappeared," she said, voice low. "I thought maybe you'd changed your mind," Garrett replied, unsure how to read her expression. She opened the white box and handed it to Maddie. Inside was a delicate silver hairpin shaped like a butterfly, glittering with tiny crystals. "It belonged to my grandmother," Juliet said, kneeling in front of Maddie. "She wore it to her first dance. I wanted you to have it." Maddie's eyes went wide. "Really?" Juliet nodded. "Really?" Garrett crouched down beside them. "You didn't have to do that." "I wanted to," she said, her voice soft. "I meant to give it to her last week, but I had to go out of town unexpectedly." Garrett didn't ask where or why. He didn't want to ruin the moment. After pinning the butterfly into Maddie's hair, Juliet stood and looked at Garrett. "May I?" she asked, extending her hand. He took it. They stepped onto the floor and the crowd parted around them. Garrett didn't think, he just moved. The music, the lights, the way her hand fit into his, it all felt like something out of someone else's life. "You look." He began, then stopped. Juliet gave a tiny smile. "Is that a compliment or a warning?" "A bit of both," he admitted. "You clean up like royalty." Her expression flickered, but she didn't look away. "I wanted to see you dance." "Then I'm glad you're here." They moved together, more in sync than ever before. Whatever tension had built between them during those weeks of practice now simmered under the surface. His hand rested at her back, her breath near his ear, too close for anything casual. "Why'd you really come back tonight?" he asked quietly. She hesitated. "I thought maybe you'd ask me to stay away," she said after a moment. "Why would I do that?" "Because you're real," she said. "And I've spent so long around people who aren't. I almost forgot what that felt like." He studied her face. "What does that mean?" Juliet looked down, then back up. "My name isn't Juliet Emerson, not really." Garrett's jaw tightened slightly. "So who are you?" She stepped back, breaking the dance. "I wanted to tell you earlier, but I didn't know how. I didn't want it to change anything." "Juliet," he he said, if that was even her name. My full name is Juliet Ashford. My father owns Ashford Capital. Garrett blinked. The real estate group, she nodded. And the investment firm and the stadium in Chicago. He stared at her, trying to fit the pieces together. So you're a millionaire, she said quietly. Technically, yes, but I didn't come here to play games. I came because I needed to leave that world for a while, and I stayed because I met you. Garrett stepped back, running a hand through his hair. You've been lying. I never lied, she said quickly. I just didn't tell you everything. Because I didn't want you to look at me the way everyone else does. He looked toward Maddie, who was now dancing with another little girl near the punch table, her silver hairpin gleaming under the lights. So what happens now? He asked. Juliet's voice dropped. That depends on whether you still want to finish the dance. He stared at her, this woman who had walked into his life in jeans and a sweater and turned everything upside down. I don't care how much money you have, he said slowly, but I do care about honesty. I know, she said, eyes shining. And I'm sorry. Garrett glanced at Maddie again, then back at Juliet. Then let's finish the dance, he said. She stepped back into his arms, and this time their rhythm was perfect. The following morning, Garrett stood at the kitchen sink, rinsing out Maddie's cereal bowl while the sounds of Saturday morning cartoons played faintly from the living room. His mind wasn't on the dishes. It was still back at the school gym, turning over the weight of Juliet's confession and the look in her eyes when she said she didn't want him to see her differently. He had seen her differently. Of course he had. How could he not? Juliet Ashford. That name wasn't just familiar, it was practically plastered on half the development projects in the state. He'd worked construction jobs on sites her family's company owned. He'd seen the name on blueprints, on permits. Even on the sign outside the fancy condo complex across town he could never afford. Garrett dried his hands on a dish towel and leaned against the counter, listening to Maddie giggle at the television. He'd promised himself he wouldn't get attached. That this dance thing was just a way to do something good for his daughter. But Juliet had walked into their lives like the wind had shifted direction. And now everything felt off balance. He didn't hear the knock at first. It was only when Maddie called out, "Daddy, someone's at the door," that he pulled himself out of his thoughts. He opened it to find Juliet standing on his porch in a wool coat and jeans. Her hair was tucked into a soft knit hat, and she held a white paper bag in one hand. "I brought coffee," she said, "and muffins. I wasn't sure if you were the type to slam the door in my face." He stepped back and opened the screen. "You keep showing up with gifts. You trying to bribe your way back in?" She walked inside slowly, eyes scanning the modest kitchen and worn floorboards. Not bribing, just hoping for a chance to talk. Maddie popped her head around the corner, her hair in a messy braid from the night before. "Miss Juliet," she squealed. Juliet crouched down. "Hi, sweetheart, you looked like a real princess last night." Garrett cleared his throat. "Maddie, go get dressed, we've got errands." "Can she come?" Maddie asked, eyes wide. He hesitated. "We'll see." Juliet stood as Maddie ran off. "I didn't come here to mess with your life, Garrett." He crossed his arms. "You didn't come here to teach dance either." "No," she admitted. "I came to get away. My father's pushing me to take over more of the business. Investors, boardrooms, all of it. But none of it felt like mine. So I took a leave. I wanted something simple, something that wasn't scripted." "And you picked our town out of a hat," she smiled faintly. "No, I remembered it. We had a summer house on the lake when I was little. I spent 3 summers here. I used to ride my bike past the hardware store and buy candy from the machine out front." Garrett's expression didn't soften. "So this was nostalgia, maybe at first," she said. "But then I met you, and Maddie. And suddenly it wasn't about hiding anymore." He looked down at the coffee she'd set on the counter. "You're not staying, are you?" "I haven't decided," she said honestly. "But I know I don't want to leave like this. I want to know if what's between us was real." He didn't answer right away. Instead, he picked up his keys and called toward the hallway. "Maddie, let's go." Juliet followed him outside, the cold air biting as they walked to his truck. "I'm heading to the hardware store," he said. "And the grocery," she nodded. "I'll ride with you if you'll let me." He didn't say no. The drive was quiet at first. Maddie hummed to herself in the back seat, swinging her legs in rhythm with the music on the radio. Juliet sat with her hands folded, Watching the snowy streets pass by, Garrett finally spoke as they pulled into the parking lot. "You're not used to hearing no, are you?" Juliet looked at him. "Not very." "Well, I'm not used to people like you showing up in my life. I get that." He turned off the engine. "So what would someone like you even want with someone like me?" "I don't know," she said. "Maybe I'm tired of being told who I should want. Maybe I met a man who's kind and real and doesn't care about image. Maybe I like the way you look at me like I'm not some trophy to be won." He stared at her for a long moment, then opened the door. "You coming inside or not?" Inside the store, Garrett moved with practiced ease, grabbing the supplies he needed: sandpaper, caulk, a new set of work gloves. Juliet followed, watching the way he exchanged greetings with the cashier and helped an elderly man carry a bag of birdseed without being asked. "You're different here," she said quietly as they walked back to the truck. "This is my world, Juliet. It's not glamorous, but it's mine. I like your world." He looked at her, eyes narrowing slightly. "You say that now." They drove in silence again until they reached the grocery store. Maddie had fallen asleep in the back seat, her head resting against the window. Juliet turned to him. "Garrett, I didn't plan any of this, but I'm not pretending, and I don't want to walk away." He exhaled, the weight of her words pressing on him. "Then what do you want?" "I want to figure this out, with you, without the noise. Without the expectations." He studied her face, the sincerity in her eyes. "It's not going to be easy." "I'm not looking for easy," she said. "I'm looking for real." He didn't reach for her hand. He didn't say anything profound. He just nodded once and climbed out of the truck. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was something. And for now, that was enough to let her stay. The first flakes of snow had already begun to fall by the time Garrett pulled up outside the old dance hall. The building had been closed for years, but tonight, it glowed from within like it had been waiting for this moment. He stepped out of the truck, boots crunching against the icy gravel, and walked around to open Maddie's door. She clutched a small bouquet of daisies in her mittened hands, her eyes wide as she stared up at the building. "Why are we here?" she asked. He adjusted his jacket collar and glanced toward the entrance. Somebody planned a surprise. Inside, soft music drifted through the air, and the scent of fresh pine mixed with something sweeter: vanilla and cinnamon. Strings of fairy lights hung from the ceiling, casting a warm glow over the polished floorboards. A long table near the wall was set with dinner for 3 real plates, cloth napkins, and silverware that gleamed like it belonged at a 5-star hotel. Juliet stood in the center of the room, wearing a deep plum dress that gathered at her waist and fell to her ankles. Her heels were modest this time, but the way she turned when she saw them made Garrett feel like the air had thickened around him. Maddie gasped and ran toward her. "You look like a fairy queen." Juliet bent to hug her. "And you, my dear, look like the flower girl in a storybook." Garrett stepped forward slowly. "You did all this?" Juliet straightened, brushing a curl from her cheek. "I rented it for the night, had to pull some strings to get it cleaned up in time. Thought we deserved a better ending to our dance lessons." He looked around, taking in the details: the soft jazz from hidden speakers, the small electric fireplace flickering in the corner, the candles that flickered in glass lanterns along the windowsills. "You didn't have to go this far." "I wanted to," she said, her voice steady, "because I haven't said everything I need to say." He walked toward her but stopped a few steps away. "Then say it." She nodded, then knelt to Maddie and handed her the daisies. "Can you help me with something very important?" Maddie blinked. "What is it?" "I need you to hold these while I talk to your dad, and when I'm done, you and I are going to eat the biggest piece of chocolate cake you've ever seen." Maddie's grin widened. "Deal?" Juliet stood again, facing Garrett fully now. "I've spent most of my life surrounded by people who made a living pretending they cared, pretending they understood. You don't do that. You don't try to impress anyone. And it scared me, because I didn't know how to be that honest." Garrett's jaw tightened slightly, but he didn't interrupt. "You showed me what it looks like to be steady, to show up when it matters, to take something as simple as a school dance and turn it into magic for your daughter. And somewhere in the middle of all of that, I fell in love with you." He let out a slow breath, something shifting behind his eyes. "I don't want to go back to New York," she said. "Not yet, maybe not ever. I want a life that feels like mine." And if you'll let me, I'd like to build part of it with you. He stepped closer, the space between them disappearing as he reached for her hand. You're not the only one who's scared, I know. But you showed up, he said. Again, and I can't ignore what that means, Juliet swallowed. So what do we do now? Garrett looked down at her hand in his, then up at Maddie, who had begun twirling with the flowers like she was in a ballet. We start with dinner and maybe a dance. Juliet's smile trembled. I'd like that. Later, after the food had been eaten and Maddie had fallen asleep in a nest of blankets near the fireplace, Garrett and Juliet danced in the center of the empty hall. No music this time, just the sound of the wind outside and the soft rhythm of their feet. You know, he said quietly, I never thought I'd be someone a woman like you would fall for. She rested her head against his shoulder. Turns out I'm not the woman people think I am. He tilted his head to look at her. Good. Because I don't want the version in the magazines. Juliet smiled, her eyes bright. Then you've got the real thing. He bent slightly, brushing his lips to her forehead. I think I'm falling in love with you too. A week later, Juliet bought the old dance hall. She didn't make a big announcement. No press releases. No ribbon cutting. Just a quiet renovation plan and a promise to keep the space open for community events, dances, weddings, even after school programs. Garrett helped with the repairs. Maddie started calling her Jules and insisted on setting a place for her at dinner twice a week. And on a snowy evening 3 months later, Garrett drove Juliet out to the lake. They stood on the dock, wrapped in coats, the moonlight shimmering on the frozen surface. I've got something for you, he said, pulling a small box from his coat pocket. Her breath caught. It wasn't a ring. Not yet, but it was a key. For the house behind the hardware store, he said. I've been fixing it up. Thought maybe you'd want to stay a while. Juliet opened the box, turned the key over in her hand, and then looked up at him with tears in her eyes. I want to stay forever. He kissed her then, slow and certain, the kind of kiss that didn't need promises, because everything they had built already spoke louder than words. And when Maddie came running across the ice moments later, bundled in 3 scarves and shouting about icicles the size of her arm, Juliet caught her mid-run and spun her around, laughter echoing across the lake. Garrett watched them, hands in his pockets, heart steady. He hadn't planned on falling for anyone. He hadn't planned on anything. But somehow, the woman who danced into his life had given him back everything he thought he'd lost: hope, joy, and a future that didn't just belong to him anymore. It belonged to all 3 of them. Garrett stood at the edge of the newly sanded deck behind the house near the hardware store, watching the early spring sun rise over the hills. The scent of fresh cut cedar still lingered in the air. Inside, the windows glowed with morning warmth, and birdsong filtered in through the open screen door. The door creaked slightly behind him, and Juliet stepped out, barefoot, with a thick cardigan wrapped around her shoulders. Her hair was slightly tousled, and a pencil was tucked behind her ear like she'd been sketching something. You're up early, she said, wrapping her arms around his waist from behind. He rested one hand over hers. Didn't want to miss this light. It hits the lake just right this time of year. She rested her chin on his shoulder. You really love this place. I do now, he said simply. They stood in silence for a moment, watching the wind ripple across the distant water. Juliet pulled away gently and crossed over to the railing where a notebook lay open, pages fluttering. I've been working on the layout for the community garden, she said. The town council approved it last night. Garrett raised an eyebrow. You're officially one of us now. She looked over her shoulder with a soft laugh. Don't act surprised. I've been bribing them with pie from your cousin's diner. He stepped up beside her, glancing down at the notebook. You've got tomatoes next to the basil. You know that's going to take over the whole bed, right? Juliet tapped her pencil on her lip. Then maybe you should help me rework the plan. He took the pencil from behind her ear and began sketching a new shape. Only if I get to name one of the planters. She leaned in. What would you call it? Maddie's patch. Juliet blinked, then smiled slowly. She'd love that. She's the one who picked out the seeds, Garrett added. She told me yesterday she wants to grow something taller than she is. Juliet laughed. Sunflowers. We'll plant a whole row. A screen door slammed in the distance, and they both looked toward the yard where Maddie burst out of the back porch, rubber boots on the wrong feet, and a watering can clutched in her hand. "Can I help plant the strawberries today?" she called out. "Only if you let me check your boots first," Juliet called back, already walking toward her. Garrett watched them, a quiet sense of amazement settling in his chest. He hadn't imagined this life, not even in his most hopeful moments. But now, with Juliet crouching to help Maddie untangle her bootstraps and the sound of laughter echoing across the yard, it felt like the only life he wanted. That afternoon, the three of them tended to the first beds together, hands in the soil, sunlight warming their backs. Juliet didn't complain about the dirt under her nails or the sweat that gathered at her brow. She worked with the same intensity she brought to everything, with care, with focus, and with heart. When the sun dipped low and the last of the seedlings were nestled in, Juliet wiped her hands on her jeans and sat back on her heels. Garrett offered her a lemonade from the cooler and sat beside her on the grass. "I was thinking," she said, taking a long sip, "we should have a summer dance here. Outdoors, string lights, music, maybe a picnic, like the old county socials," he asked. She nodded. "But better, with food trucks, live music, and a donation table for the school library." He leaned back on his elbows. "You've really taken this town to heart." "I think it took me first," she said. "I haven't felt like I belonged anywhere since I was a teenager, not in the city, not in my family's boardrooms, but here," she glanced toward the lake. "Here people see me, not my last name." "Just me?" Garrett turned toward her, the seriousness in his expression grounding the moment. "Do you ever miss it? The other life?" She considered that. "Sometimes, the noise, the rush. But then I remember what it felt like to come home to an empty apartment. I don't want to go back to a life that's all glass walls and echoing silence." He reached for her hand. "I don't have glass walls, but I've got a leaky faucet, a backyard full of squirrels, and a daughter who thinks you hung the moon." Juliet smiled down at their joined hands. "That's better than any penthouse." Garrett stood, brushing the grass from his jeans. "Come with me." She followed him without hesitation, past the garden beds and the wide oak tree that had stood behind the house for over 70 years. He stopped beneath the branches, reached into his back pocket, and pulled out a tiny velvet box. Juliet's breath caught. "I know this isn't the life you were born into," he said, "but it's the one I'm building. And I want you in it every morning, every night, every messy, beautiful, ordinary day." She opened the box slowly. Inside sat a simple gold band, delicately etched with tiny vines, a single sapphire set in the center. "It's not flashy," he said, "but it's real, like us." "Like this?" Juliet looked up, eyes full of emotion. "Ask me." He reached for her hand. "Juliet Ashford, will you marry me?" She didn't hesitate. "Yes. Yes, Garrett, I will." They kissed beneath the oak tree, the garden behind them, the house ahead of them, and the future stretched wide open. That summer, the backyard dance bloomed into something magical. Strings of lights twinkled overhead as neighbors gathered, music played, and laughter spilled through the trees. Maddie wore a crown of sunflowers and passed out lemonade cups from a booth she built with Garrett. Juliet stood beside Garrett in a soft white sundress, barefoot on the grass, as they swayed slowly to a classic tune. The community clapped and cheered when he twirled her once, twice, then dipped her low. Later that night, when the last guests had left and Maddie was asleep on a blanket under the stars, Garrett and Juliet lay side by side, hands entwined. "Do you still think I don't belong here?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He pressed a kiss to her temple. "You don't just belong here, you made this home." She smiled and closed her eyes, and in the quiet that followed, nothing else in the world mattered.